Hey, it's Daily Drive executive producer Jake Neer in Detroit. Thanks for joining me for this bonus episode of the show. Earlier this week, I spoke with Ronald Kleiwicht, CEO of Vinturas, about how the Iran war is disrupting automotive supply chains and why he believes supply chain disruption has shifted from episodic to structural. We brought you the first part of that conversation on Tuesday's episode. If you missed it, go back and check it out. In this second part, Kleiwicht explains why the crisis is fundamentally different from the pandemic, how companies are shifting sourcing strategies away from Europe and the Middle East, and why executives need to prioritize geopolitical risk over cost when making sourcing decisions. Here's the rest of my conversation with Ronald Kleiwicht of Vinturas. This is sort of the crux of this conversation that I've been sort of wondering about for months now. and it's exactly what you've been saying. You argue that disruption is no longer episodic, that it's becoming structural. Some analysts actually have said the opposite, that supply chains have actually stabilized since 2022. What is the evidence that convinces you that this is a long-term shift?
Well, you can argue it's stabilized because it's a stabilized crisis. There's a crisis almost every week, every month in the meantime, right?
so
then you
it's
can
kind
call
of
it also
both.
level of stabilization.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of crisis management in my career, right? From the Iceland volcano to Fukushima and everything else, right? And I always said at that time, it always happens on a Friday or a weekend, and most of the time at a quarter end. And nowadays, it's ongoing. One of the big LSPs, right, already said, we used to have peak times, right? Chinese New Year or Golden. But now there's not even peak times anymore because it's such a big issue. So yeah, to deal with that level of crisis, you need to be extremely resilient in the way you manage your business. And like I said, you need to have a plan A, B, or C. And yeah, this may still take a while till things. I don't even know what stabilize means in the meantime anymore. In a way, right? Because if you think about it, you refer to the pandemic. Everybody thought in the pandemic, right, the world will never be the same again. Nobody talks about the pandemic anymore. And at the time in the pandemic, nobody would have expected we are now having 4 world wars in the meantime. So, yeah, you need to have a lot of flexibility, a lot of resilience in managing supply chain of today. So stabilization means we literally be on top of everything and having a plan A, B, C, D.
So are you saying that this level of disruption could become sustainable, or is it unsustainable regardless of how we adapt here?
Yeah, depends how you want to define unsustainable or sustainable, because the point is, yes, things will be over, right? Hopefully soon wars will be over, but then there is a level of recovery required, because a lot of damage which have been done is not, let's say, resolved overnight either. So there's a lot of recovery required, which again is different than a pandemic. In the pandemic, we were all sitting at home, but then when the pandemic was over, life continued. Now there has been done so much damage, and also changing routes. You don't change routes all of a sudden overnight, right? A lot of people have said already, when the moment the Suez is open, immediately, right? If everybody start to reroute immediately, like they used to, then ports will be over congested. So you have to do it in a very, very controlled way. And then all the areas which have been damaged, right? And recovery is required. Damage is done. Damage needs to be recovered. So it will take a while before things are becoming normal again. So we have to deal with it.
So, what one of the things I've been thinking about is that on one level, so many of these problems, challenges are geopolitical in nature. There's also these ordinary logistics issues like port congestion, labor shortages, sort of the more long-term issues that we've seen with supply chains. How do those two things work together or work against each other to, in terms of how the industry is thinking about what to prioritize at this point?
No, but that's a very good point, Jake, because we almost forget that we have ordinary issues as well, because you're absolutely right. When the next generation ocean vessels started to increase, it created a lot of port congestion and a lot of inland congestion as well. And particularly where I am living here, right, where you have the port of Rotterdam and the port of Antwerp, there are massive issues right now with congestion, especially for the drayage companies, right, which have hours and hours of waiting hours before they can deliver or collect containers at the port. So yeah, and that's what I mean, right? We already have ordinary issues. And now these kind of other issues on top makes it even worse in a way, right? To deal with these kind of issues, because the more unpredictability there is, the worse it even could, because you cannot plan anymore. It's so hard to plan. It's like I said, it's a wedding cake. It's every issue is on top of another issue, and where do you start and how do you prioritize? You're absolutely right. But stability at the end of the day, as always in business, you need to have a level of stability. Companies don't like instability, no matter if it's political or economical. Any disruption, right, is causing problems in your planning, and that's in production planning, that's in your shipment planning, in schedules. We need to come back to a level of stability. That instability, that is the biggest impact to the entire world economy in the meantime.
Now, your research says that companies are shifting sources away from Europe and the Middle East and toward the Americas and Asia. How much of that is really happening in automotive? You know, we see press releases a lot about, you know, the intended switching of manufacturing to the U.S. or North America. But in terms of the bigger picture, what does that look like?
So I think if you look at automotive in particular, right, there was always, I make a difference between assembly and production, manufacturing, right, in a way. So for a long time, even when assembly moved to, let's say, China to a large extent, offshoring, still a lot of those parts and components did actually come from Europe, right? A lot of parts and components, strategic parts and components, I would call it, were coming still from Germany and other countries, shipped into China, where they did the local assembly for the local market or the Asian market. But in the meantime, a lot of parts and components, right, are now coming from China, because China, right, in the meantime learned, we educated them. And rather than becoming an assembler, they also become more production, especially on the EV side. Now they're building a lot of strategic parts and components for EVs, particularly in China. And now the Chinese companies are doing local assembly the other way around, right, in Europe, right, for instance, right? Look at Xpeng, that's public information. They use Magna Steyr in Austria as an example, right, for their local assembly, bringing in the parts and components, right, for that part. So is the world upside down? And I think what companies are now looking, in automotive in particular, but also some other industries, is to look for alternatives and sourcing, right, of parts and components other than Asia or China. Because originally companies looked at beneficiary countries for China, looking in Asia, right, places like Thailand, Cambodia, whatever. But still, then you're heavily depending on long lead times out of China. So I think you see already parts and components providers looking for alternatives in Europe, particularly, for instance, in Morocco. If you look at Morocco, where there are already automotive sites, assembly plants like PSA, Renault, and some others, where 60% of the local sourcing is already coming from Morocco itself, I think that becomes important, right? So if you can start doing really sourcing your parts and components more from closer to where your assembly or production sites are, yeah, that can reduce the impact, right, on what we had just been discussing on port congestion, unreliable routing, and what have you. So yeah, I probably for strategic parts and components, I think companies start to look at alternatives more and more now to bringing it closer to where their assembly and production sites are.
And is it bringing it closer, or is it diversifying around the globe? I mean, or is it both? You know, that it seems to me like every time you move a component, or if you're building a new plant based on something that could be a short-term crisis, that's a lot of capital to invest.
No, I think it's both. It's both,
okay,
in a way, because certain materials are simply not available. Look at these rare earth materials; they're only available at certain locations. So yeah, you cannot do local sourcing. So yeah, you're still heavily depending on those. But in another way, you're right. I mean, but there are certain components or parts which you can still do at different locations. But I'll give you an example, Jake. When the war started, right, in Russia, Ukraine, a lot of parts and components were coming from Ukraine and affected some of the German automotives. And at that time, without going into names, we were asking, well, why is that an issue? Because you're using the same, let's say, cable harnesses at your plants in Mexico. So why don't you source them from Mexico? And then they said, well, technically that's possible, but they are not VDA approved, VDA regulated. So now there was a standard which somehow blocked them, right, from using those parts and components. So technically and physically it was possible to move them, but in this case regulatory became an issue in sourcing them from another location. So sometimes there's other reasons why they cannot source them. But I think if you solve these kind of problems, where you can have a BCP, business continuity plan, that you can use parts and components, right, which you use in other regions and start really rerouting them. So I think it's both. In some areas, you can do, you bring your sourcing closer to your production sites, but that could let's say, create disadvantages, right, on the leverage you're having. So you may still look for more central locations, but then you need to see at least not being depending on one source, let's say one location. That's my point. You probably need to have at least one or two or three, so you become less depending, right? And you can do replenishment, right, and do it in a much better way.
All right, so to close things out here, for an automotive supplier executive listening to this today, what's the one practical change that they should be making to their supply chain right now and their strategy for their supply chain?
I think, first of all, to me, but my personal opinion, is sourcing strategy. Where do you source your parts and components? Like you said, is it single sourced, dual sourced, which locations, what geographies? And that has to do with risk economically or politically, tax impact, of course, as well. And then the rest you can orchestrate around it, right? Then you can decide what mode of transport am I using, what's the cost of logistics in such a way. But I think more in the old days, it was always about labor cost, logistics cost. I think now it's really about geolocation and the risk in that geolocation. I think, to me, sourcing strategy, because of geo risk, I think is at this moment the most important one. And then labor cost and tax impact and logistic cost is then secondary in a way. Otherwise, the reliability and unreliability of your supply chain is simply at risk.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Daily Drive. Really appreciate your input.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jake. Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome.
Coming up on this bonus episode of Daily Drive, International Motorsports Association President John Doonan talks about record attendance and the future of sports car racing. That's next on Daily Drive.
NVIDIA is betting on cars. And this week, I got a closer look at the company's strategy. On this week's episode of the Automotive News Shift podcast, I'm joined by Ali Khani, NVIDIA's Vice President of Automotive. We talk inside of a moving, NVIDIA-powered Level 2 vehicle about the company's automotive goals and how its chips are managing the complex tasks required for automated driving.
The industry is at an inflection point. Every car will want to be autonomous.
Plus, I'll recap NVIDIA's GTC in San Jose, including why CEO Jensen Huang says autonomous driving tech is a solved problem.
It's definitely a solved problem. The rest of this is engineering refinement.
I'm Molly Boygan. Join me on Shift, available this Sunday wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. The 2026 WeatherTech Sports Car Championship kicked off in January with the Rolex 24 at Daytona, and the results were historic. The International Motorsports Association saw record ticket sales, unprecedented fan engagement on the midway, and what IMSA President John Doonan calls an electric atmosphere. But the association isn't just celebrating strong attendance. The sanctioning body announced a groundbreaking partnership with NASA, positioning the racetrack as a testing ground for technology that could benefit both motorsports and space exploration. This weekend, the championship continued with the 12 hours of Sebring endurance race at Sebring International Raceway in Florida. That race happened on Saturday, between when I'm recording this and when you're hearing it. Our own Jack Walsworth caught up with John at Daytona International Speedway to talk about what's driving the growth, how IMSA is positioning itself as a technology platform, and what's ahead for the rest of the 2026 season. Here's Jack's conversation with IMSA President John Doonan.
So I know this is obviously the kickoff to the season. How are you feeling about the 2026 season as we start?
Yeah, really, knock wood. Want the momentum that we've seen to continue. We had over 80 interested teams to come that wanted to come to the Rolex 24. Obviously, we ended up with 60 here. Michelin Pilot Challenge, 51 cars here. Even a single make like Mazda MX-5 Cup set a record entry, for their series over time. And so I think the health of the sport across many different platforms, where it's independent teams, privateer teams, to I'll call them factory endorsed efforts, is at really an all-time high. We are responsible for making sure that costs stay in check, that the venues that we visit are valuable to them from a marketing standpoint, that the television package we have with NBC is strong, that we provide stability, which is long-term partnership with WeatherTech, long-term partnership with Michelin. All those pieces fit together. It gives me a lot of hope for 26, and we will at Sebring in 40 some days announce the 27 calendar. So you have the stability, but then you give an additional runway to teams for planning for the next season and beyond.
Sure. So you probably can't share too many details on the next calendar, but do you anticipate any changes or updates?
Yeah, I think one thing's for sure. We have got a really solid set of events where people are planning on, such and such weekend at such and such venues. We've had consistency. I think what you're going to see, because of the number of series we sanction, and that's now 10, potentially 11 different platforms that IMSA sanctions, we run out of actual run time on the race weekends. Sure. And I think nearly every one of our weekends in the summer is a 5-series weekend. You're capped by pit lane space and paddock and garage space, and also by the number of hours in the day. Sure. So the excitement of that is a fan can buy a ticket and they literally have entertainment from 8 in the morning till sometimes 8 p.m., which is amazing. But we're going to need some other weekends to build up. For example, we've done at Mid-Ohio the last few years a Michelin pilot feature. And then you put some single make content in there, maybe our VP Racing Sports Car Challenge, and you can build quite a nice little weekend. We're going to need some more weekends like that to try to make sure we get all the schedules in.
Sure. Well, John, it's great being here with you in Daytona. Thanks for being on Daily Drive.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep.
Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of Daily Drive. We'll be back on Monday with a brand new full episode of the show.